In his 2012 article, Technics Beyond the Temporal Object, Mark Hansen describes his personal excitement at first reading Bernard Stiegler's multi-volume work on technics. And as Hansen goes on to discuss, in part the interest in Stiegler's work was its close relationship with his own work. So Hansen's first book, Embodying Technesis, highlights the failure of philosophy and cultural studies to really take account of technology, and argues that their impact on experience is at once so primitive and so pervasive that any attempt to fathom it through cultural critique will have already presupposed what it sets out to isolate and clarify. In a similar way, Stiegler consistently argues that philosophy represses a technological condition that ought to be its proper question. Indeed, in his earlier article, Real-Time Synthesis and the Difference of the Body, Hansen argues that the ultimate consequence of Stiegler's correlation of the human and the technical is the rediscovery of deconstruction within cultural studies, transforming cultural studies into techno-cultural studies. And both writers, albeit at different stages in their development, have been greatly influenced by the work of Simondon. And Hansen ends his New Philosophy of New Media with an appeal to the concept of the pre-individual and makes extensive use of Simondon in his later book, Bodies in Code. So ostensibly, the projects of these two writers share many assumptions and occupy much of the same terrain. Nevertheless, there are important distinctions between their work, which are apparent from the outset, and which I intend to explore here. And in particular, a careful reading of Hansen's critique of Stiegler can help to clarify the theoretical projects of both writers, perhaps. So the roots of this critique can be found in his earlier article, Real-Time Synthesis and the Difference of the Body, where Hansen sees Stiegler making a productive break with Derrida. And he says, Stiegler's work, as I see it, forges a much-needed position between positivism and abstraction, between the various strategies for positivizing difference that one finds in contemporary cultural studies, for example, in the radical empiricism of audience research studies, and more general in the ubiquitous call for exploitations of heterogeneity as a positive, that is, concrete phenomenon, and the retreat to pre-technical, pre-cultural quasi-politics of the promise that Derrida has recently articulated. In this simple sense, Hansen expresses a common objection to Derrida's deconstruction of speech and writing, while installing material inscription at the heart of thought, and Derrida nonetheless focuses on the quasi-transcendental status of what he calls archi-writing, and ignores or even eliminates the material specificity of different forms of inscription. For example, Mark Poster, taking Derrida's comments on McLuhan in his essay Signature Event Context as a basis, argues that Derrida's focus on archi-writing eliminates media specificity, and indeed one might say the problematic of media itself. Obviously, I don't agree with that. However, while Derrida does object to the idea that he finds in McLuhan that a new form of media is replacing discursive mediation with a communicative transparency beyond writing, it's not at all clear that this leads Derrida to a wholesale dismissal of the specificity of different forms of writing or different forms of media. Indeed, in Archive Fever, Derrida himself speculates about the geotechnological shocks that would have been visited on the psychoanalytic archive and thereby discourse and practice had Freud and his contemporaries communicated by email rather than by writing letters. In some ways, the argument that Derrida ignores the specificity of different technological forms can be seen as a misunderstanding of the very status of archi-writing as quasi-transcendental. The emphasis on archi-writing as the condition of mediation in general in no simple way eliminates the question of media specificity. However, it is fair to say that Hansen has a more extensive argument about writing waiting in the wings, one that goes to the heart of his own thinking about technology. And that argument can be found in his first book. Is there any water, actually?
Yes.
Thank you. That argument can be found in his first book, Embodying Technesis. Here Hansen mounts a robust attack on existing forms of cultural critique of technology. The reasoning bears equally on social studies of science and post-structuralist influenced accounts of technology. These approaches share the problem which Hansen calls technesis, the putting into discourse of technology. By focusing on the, quote, technical modification of representation, they lose sight of the robust materiality of technology and of our experience of it beyond representation in the material rhythms of embodied life. In other words, by embracing a certain materiality of representation, they fail to reckon with a more profound embodied account of materiality and technology in general. And this is a quote from Hansen again. The various materialities invoked by the aforementioned cultural critics, materialities encountered in cultural and social life, in virtual hardware, software, and in the non-signifying elements of language, all comprise examples of the quasi-materiality or relative exteriority that Derrida's critique of logocentrism unleashes within the domain of thought. As mere supplement or material support to the production of knowledge, thought, desire, none can furnish the site for resistance against the imperialism of theoretical or linguistic idealism. So this is Hansen's position. And in that book, Embodying Technicis, he takes aim at a number of post-structuralist thinkers such as Heidegger, Lacan, Deleuze, and calls them to account for their contribution to this technicis approach, which he dislikes. However, as the above quote, perhaps this quote in fact sort of gives away, it is predominantly and most particularly Derrida who Hansen seems to hold responsible for the reduction of technology to representational technology. The argument against Derrida seems to be that by finding technicity and materiality at the centre of language, Derrida therefore thinks materiality and technicity only as a dimension of or support for language. In doing so, he lays the foundation for conceiving technology primarily as the exteriorization of thought. This is Hansen's argument. Against this, Hansen advocates an understanding of an affective or embodied understanding of technology, an argument which he develops at greater length in New Philosophy for New Media. He can therefore be seen, as Patricia Clough argues, as part of the affective turn in cultural studies. But how credible is this account of Derrida? In Embodying Technicis, Hansen argues that Derrida defines exteriority as the exteriority of meaning, but the sentence he is citing from of grammatology actually reads, the epoch of the Logos thus debases writing considered as, this is a quote, the epoch of the Logos thus debases writing considered as mediation of mediation and as a fall into the exteriority of meaning. It is not at all clear that in saying this, Derrida defines exteriority as the exteriority of meaning. The general form of Hansen's argument seems to be that if representation is exteriorization, then exteriorization is or exteriority in general is representation. That does not follow as a general logic, and there are also good reasons for supposing it is not true in the case of Derrida. And Jeremy Gilbert puts it very succinctly in an article about affect and cultural studies, in which he takes a slightly sceptical approach to the affective turn. And I don't have this quote on the slides, but he says, Derrida's notion of the architrace, which precedes signification as such, of an always already disseminated writing, which precedes speech and all the rest, is right from the start a deliberate problematization of the very distinction between signifier and signified on which the Saussurean break in cultural studies rests. In these terms, culture will be thought of as the order not of the signifier, but of the trace, and such a thinking of culture would necessarily finally displace the privilege accorded to meaning as a defining characteristic of culture and the cultural. So, and what I'd like to argue is that what Gilbert's trying to bring out there is actually equally applicable to this idea of technicis in Hansen, as a problem in Hansen. In other words, in place of reducing exteriority to the exteriority of meaning, exteriority here breaches meaning from the outset, i.e. in Derrida. On Gilbert's reading, far from reducing everything to discourse, Derrida not only legitimates the erasure of the distinction between the discursive and the non-discursive, but must simultaneously erase the conceptual hierarchy which accords verbal language priority as the key metaphor for all other forms of social practice. This is quite the opposite of what Hansen argues, where the erasure of the distinction between discursive and non-discursive seems to extend the domain of linguistic imperialism. In principle, although Gilbert does not argue this, one might also suggest that the architrace challenges the distinction between affection and perception that is so central to Hansen's own account. But let us suppose, so the argument here is that I think this idea of technicis, which he brings out in his first book, and is I think quite important for Hansen, actually, in as much as it's founded on a kind of account of Derrida, has some, could be seen to have this problem within it from the outset. But let us suppose, for the purposes of our discussion here, that we accept Hanssen's reading of Derrida. Where does that leave Stiegler? Well, here obviously, but other than that very prosaic sense. Would not his theme to technics, the exteriorization of memory and grammatization, or his extension of Derrida's own problematic of archae-writing, make his work an even more refined instance of the tendency Hanssen condemns as technesis? In one sense, Hanssen's answer to this question appears from the outset to be yes. In part, this is due to the emphasis Stiegler places on mnemotechnics, and picking up on Geoffrey Bennington's early observation that the concept of tool is too restrictive, Hanssen argues that Stiegler's unbending commitment to memory, Stiegler's explanation cannot even recognise that there is a more primordial level at which technology impacts or contaminates experience. I'm just going to skip a bit where I go into that in a little bit more detail. On the other hand, at least in his earlier accounts, Hanssen's response is moderated by an appreciation of the originality and interest of Stiegler's project. And one way of putting it would be that even if Stiegler's account of technology ultimately affirms the technesis approach, the path he follows in arriving at that destination can aid the break with technesis that Hanssen seeks. If he still thinks in terms of technesis, he goes far beyond Derrida in his understanding of the contamination of thought by techniques for Hanssen. So, one aspect of Stiegler's novelty for Hanssen is, as we've seen, his positivism, but his other innovation is his transformation of Husserl. And here I would, in sort of longer version, go into a reading of that transformation of Husserl, but I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit. So I talk a little bit about the reading of Husserl, and then I talk about the industrial temporal object. What the gramophone record illustrates is twofold. Firstly, this is a quote from Stiegler, as the phonographic revelation of the structure of all temporal objects, unquote. It demonstrates that tertiary memory is constitutive of all primary retention and reveals, as Hanssen puts it, this is Hanssen's reading, the intrinsically technical basis of time consciousness. Now, the other great example of the industrial temporal object is to be found in cinema. As Hanssen puts it, for Stiegler, this situation is best exemplified by cinema, all the more so because cinema is the technological art of selection par excellence. In cinema, more than any other recording technology, the selection criteria through which consciousness passes on prior attentions is first and foremost the work of tertiary memory. Cinematic perception, we select almost exclusively from memories of experience that have not been lived by us, by situating the flux of consciousness to the flux of a temporal object that is almost entirely composed of tertiary memories. Cinema exerts an objective stranglehold over time consciousness. So, in this sense, for Hanssen, on Hanssen's reading, cinema for Stiegler is not just one industrial temporal object among many, but the exemplary contemporary technical object. This is partly because of the relationship between perception and technical selection, as Hanssen points out here, but it is also because it brings to the fore the relationship between the temporal object and its systematic commercial exploitation, the industrialization and politics of memory. As Hanssen argues elsewhere, cinema in the wider sense, understood by Stiegler, is the object of a media system that aims precisely and in the most calculated manner imaginable to subordinate the subjective flux of thinking to pre-programmed and thoroughly standardized temporal patterns of media artifacts. How am I doing? Time. Okay. However sympathetic he may be to this account of the industrial temporal object, in the final chapter of New Philosophy for New Media, Hanssen outlines a problem with Stiegler's conception of cinema, one which makes it diverge both from Deleuze's account and Hanssen's own Bergson-inspired critique of Deleuze's account, which is outlined in the earlier chapters. And that's the well-known argument with Deleuze in New Philosophy for New Media. This is because what is distinctive about the Bergsonist Deleuzean understanding of cinema is the way that perception places consciousness into a relation with a domain fundamentally heterogeneous to it. If the contribution that Stiegler makes is to demonstrate through cinema the technical contamination of time consciousness, the limitation for Hansen is that it forecloses on the possibility of cinema introducing to consciousness anything beyond perception of the temporal object. And this is in fact a reiteration of the argument against technesis in general, which is why I think this technesis argument continues to sort of kind of control Hansen's account through the later books. As Hansen puts it, quote, for Stiegler, the range of what a film can present is necessarily limited to that which can take the form of memory that could be proper to consciousness, even if for the most part it is not. Noting that this limitation can be extended beyond cinema to the impact of technology on perception in general, he then asks rhetorically whether the understanding of cinema as tertiary memory doesn't curtail, quote, cinema's capacity to change life. But how exactly does Hansen think moving beyond the limits of perception and memory allows cinema to change life? As elsewhere in New Philosophy for New Media, and also in Bodies and Code, the place to find this radicalization of cinema, or indeed move beyond cinema, is new media art. In this context, Hansen seeks to counter Stiegler's understanding of cinema through the example of Bill Viola's Quintet for the Astonished. Viola's video installation was shot on high-speed, 384 frames per second film, and then transferred and slowed down on video. The result is a 16-minute piece depicting, I'm not going to play 16 minutes, depicting in slow motion the changing emotions in the faces of 5 actors. Hansen emphasizes in his account Viola's insight into the autonomy of emotion beyond time. He charts the way in which the spectator of Quintet for the Astonished is taken beyond the temporal object. He says, don't do that. When the viewer takes in this intensely oversaturated temporal object, this is a quote from Hansen, the guiding mechanism of cinematic temporality, the perceptual coincidence between the flux of the film and that of consciousness, gives way to a kind of affective contagion for which consciousness, by being put face to face with what it cannot properly perceive, and yet what constitutes the very condition out of which the perceivable emerges, undergoes a profound self-affection. In this incredibly intense experience, consciousness is made to live through, affectively, not perceptively, the very process for which it continually emerges, as a selection from a none live strictly contemporaneous with it. This reading of Viola turns out to be pivotal to Hansen's project. What the experience of Quintet for the Astonished achieves is to confront the consciousness of the spectator with the constitutive role of her own affective embodiment. It is evidence of Hansen's fundamental neo-Bergsonist assertion that perception is rooted via affect in the activity of the body. In effect, there are 2 linked claims here. First is the bodily basis for affectivity, and the second is that affectivity is constitutive of perception. This claim is also the basis of Hansen's criticism of Deleuze's theory of cinema. The argument there is that Deleuze makes the affect image a type of perception, and thereby divorces affect from its bodily basis. Deleuze is also therefore at odds with Bergson, who in Hansen's reading clearly separates affection and perception. New Philosophy for New Media contends that both Stiegler and Deleuze's very different understandings of cinema founder on their failure to move beyond perception. Both therefore fail to provide a framework for understanding the true radical potential or Bergsonist vocation of contemporary new media as the catalyst for the expansion of the margin of indetermination constitutive of our technically facilitated embodiment. And then I have a section that I'm afraid I'm going to have to miss out as well, which is basically about Bernard's reading of On connaît la chanson in De la misère symbolique, and I just make some comparisons with, talk a little bit about René's homage to Dennis Potter and some other aspects of that. But the point really there is just to say that actually I think Bernard's account of cinema is a bit more subtle than Hansen thinks. So Simondon argues that the rise of the machine tool removes the ability of the skilled worker to differentiate the labour from that of other workers. Stiegler sees the loss of individuation extended in hyper-industrial society to consciousness through new teletechnologies and their industrialization of memory. For him, the process of industrialization is also a grammatization, that is to say, a process analogous to that of the development of writing, by which idiomatic actions are standardized, discretized, and materialized. As he puts it, quote, "The current loss of individuation is a stage of grammatization where three individuations, psychic, collective, and technomachinic, generalize the formalization by calculation." However, Stiegler also makes a break with Simondon, arguing that the latter failed to connect his twin thesis about technical individuation on the one hand, and psychic or collective individuation on the other. For Stiegler, psychosocial individuation depends on a pre-individual that is essentially constituted through organized inorganic objects. In this context, it might seem odd that Hansen, in his reading of Viola's new media artwork, seems to oppose the Simondonian concept of the pre-individual to Stiegler's model of grammatization. So we can thus say that Viola's work this is a quote from Hansen again, deploys media to catalyze a temporal experience that moves beyond the cinematographic grammatization that for Stiegler forms the basis of contemporary real-time media. What Viola shows is that media, far from being the vehicle for reproduction, writing, or grammatization of life, is a mechanism for exposing the fundamental correlation of life with what Gilbert Simondon calls the pre-individual, the domain of an unlived, that is strictly contemporaneous with the living and that forms the condition of possibility for its continued viability in the future. And this quote, it really illustrates how close and yet how different Hansen and Stiegler's respective positions are. Both see the Simondonian pre-individual as central to their account of technology, but whereas for Stiegler the pre-individual is itself structured by the non-lived as the already there of tertiary memory, for Hansen the pre-individual is the experience of affectivity, which names the modality that differs fundamentally from perception. Hansen can support this by pointing to Simondon's distinction in L'individuation psychique et collective between perception as belonging to the already constituted individual and affectivity as the relation between the individualized being and pre-individual reality. This seems to give affect a central role in the possibility of new individuations. Hansen's point then is that Stiegler's concept of tertiary memory, derived as it is from Husserl's understanding of the perception of the temporal object, cannot in fact account for the affective in relation with the pre-individual. However, the problem with Hansen's account is that it does not take seriously Stiegler's own reworking of Simondon. As he has made clear on numerous occasions, Stiegler actually makes a significant break with Simondon. He admits freely that their understandings of the pre-individual differ. Indeed, Stiegler finds it surprising that Simondon does not think psychic, social, and technical individuation alongside each other. In doing so himself, he brings together the pre-individual with Heidegger's concept of the historial already there. But Stiegler, unlike Heidegger, thinks this already there as technically constituted as tertiary memory. This creates a very different perspective. Quote, this is another quote from Stiegler. The individuation process results from an irreducible inadequation at the heart of the individual, as always incomplete, but also as the play of pre-individual forces in the individual, interiorized, interpretable tertiary retentions that are equally at play in social individuation, in which the psychic individual participates in the individuation process. Interpreted in this way, the pre-individual, different from Simondon's interpretation, is the already there, the potential for an inadequation instantiated by the psychological individual. And this quotation illustrates very clearly Stiegler's difference from both Simondon and Hansen. Here, the singularity of the individual, its inadequacy or potential for new individuation, is equated with the possibility of reinterpreting the pre-individual already there. This already there is given in the exteriorized form of tertiary memory, recordings, artifacts, systems of writing, and so on. This passage is a reminder of the argument about orthographic writing in the second volume of Technics and Time, where the individual who is conceived as the experience of the infinite recontextualization of the already there of writing. Individuation here is the potential for new interpretations. One can readily see how this reading of individuation as a potential for reinterpretation would confirm Hanson's suspicion that Stiegler, as with other thinkers of technesis, simply reduces the technical through interpretation to the exteriorization of thought. But it also underlines the subtle difference in the way they think about indetermination. For Hanson, indetermination is an intrinsic property of human affective embodiment. The body is the center of indetermination. For Stiegler, indetermination is the product of a transductive relationship between the who and the what, and new technical configurations may indeed result, at least temporarily, in a loss of individuation. For that reason, psychic and collective individuation is inseparable from technical individuation. Another way of thinking about this is to say, how is it possible for cinema to think something new? For Deleuze, this belongs to the capacity of cinematic perception to go beyond or extend human perception. For Hanson, on the other hand, the newness can only emerge to the extent that new media art goes beyond cinematic perception in engaging with our affective embodiment. For Stiegler, cinema is most often the name for a globalized grammatization and programming of consciousness that in fact forecloses or reduces the possibility for differentiation or newness. However, within that, there is always the possibility, as with René, for cinema itself to allow us to reinterpret this cinematic condition. As Patrick Krogan points out, it is only through inventive, idiosyncratic adoptions of the technical system that new relations can emerge in the form of what Stiegler calls epochal redoubling, and art in general is one of the mechanisms by which that can take place. Ultimately, what finally emerges from Stiegler's engagement with cinema is very different from that of Hanson, despite the commonality in the terrain they explore. The rethinking of cinema on the basis of Husserl as the industrial temporal object is only ever the prolegomena to a wider project. The point here is not a narrow claim about the technical contamination of perception, but to establish through the concept of tertiary memory a wider argument about the intrinsic link between technical, psychic and collective individuation. This indeed involves a substantial rethinking of Simondon and a rearticulation of his work with the technesis tradition that Hanson identifies in Heidegger and Derrida. Stiegler's problematic illuminates the potential problem with Hanson's reading of Simondon in his own focus on an account of technology in terms of human embodied experience. This leads Hanson, I think, to a version of individuation that is perhaps too focused on human individuation, psychic or collective. Hanson perhaps loses sight of what Stiegler understands as technical individuation or grammatization, in favour of thinking technology as the robust materiality of effective experience. I've slightly overcut here, so I've in fact finished. I'm actually finished a bit early. So that's it.